Thank you very much for your opening remarks. Our presentation today draws upon the research and analysis that Dianne and I undertook in the 1990s for the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which resulted in historic site designations. As mentioned, in 1995, the pre-1920 buildings of the Kingston General Hospital were designated as a National Historic Site, and then 2 years later, based on research that Dianne did, the Baillie building, one of these buildings, got a separate designation as a part of a broader designation of nursing residences in Canada. We'd like to share with you our thoughts on the Kingston General Hospital buildings, as well as on the other historic nursing residences. What do they reveal about the history and evolution of medical treatment in general, and specifically about the development of nursing as a profession? Anniversaries are a great way to bring attention to past achievements, and we're very pleased to be here on the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston, and as was mentioned earlier, the 125th anniversary of the founding of the nursing school at Kingston General Hospital. I just thought I'd throw in here that Parks Canada is also celebrating this year. We're marking the 100th anniversary as an organization because it was in May 19th, we're almost at that 100-year mark, 1911, that the Government of Canada established the Dominion Park Service, the first national park service in the world, so that the then national parks would have better services and programs. Over the past 100 years, the system of protected heritage places administered by Parks Canada has evolved and matured considerably. Parks Canada now administers over 150 National Historic Sites, which really illustrate the diverse aspects of Canada's past over thousands of years. But what's important to note is that the majority of Canada's National Historic Sites are owned and administered by others. And in this regard, I would like to underline the critical stewardship role by the Kingston General Hospital and the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston in sustaining these historic buildings. Let's begin with a brief look at the pre-1920 buildings at Kingston General Hospital. When Dr. Lowe initially brought the hospital to the attention of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada in 1989, he felt that its significance might rest in its former use as a temporary parliament for the province of Canada, which it did in the 1840s. However, I'm reflecting that in the aftermath of yet another federal election in May of 2011, that it seems to me that politics was likely not the key way to engage Canadians in this place. When I researched the hospital and compared it to others in Canada, I was really struck both by its age as an institution and by how its architecture revealed the evolution of healthcare. Today we take for granted the fundamental role of hospitals in the development and delivery of healthcare, but until the early 20th century, healthcare was mainly done in the home, and hospitals were really for the poor and the destitute. They were, as one historian has noted, marginal institutions that treated the socially marginal. Completed in 1835, Kingston's Hospital was the third purpose-built general hospital in Canada, predated by examples in Toronto and Montreal that have since been demolished. Its construction reflected the status of Kingston as a community with over 3,000 people at the time, which received many sick immigrants each year. The illustration you see here of the hospital, which is from the lakeside in the early 1860s, shows how the architecture was reminiscent of large homes at the time, alluding to the home as the preferred place for health care. Nursing at this time, like many aspects of medical practice, was not well developed as a profession and was primarily focused on the custodial care of patients. Following the opening of a medical school at Queen's College in the 1850s, there was a modest operating room set up on one of the upper floors of the hospital. But the name of the facility, the amputating theatre, was indicative of the limited surgical procedures attempted, and the emphasis, I think, was as much on studying the sick as curing them. Well, if we take the same perspective, the same view from the lake, and we jump ahead 40 years, you can see how much has changed as the hospital has been transformed from really a charitable place for the poor to a facility of scientific medicine increasingly focused on surgery. The understanding of the germ theory of disease and the perfection of antiseptic procedures requiring a meticulously clean surgical environment, encouraged doctors to move beyond amputation and to attempt new procedures, especially in the abdominal cavity. At the Kingston General Hospital, these medical breakthroughs led to a veritable construction boom in the 1890s, which included the nickel wing to isolate patients with infectious diseases, and the Doran building, which was a self-contained hospital for maternity care and gynecological diseases. The transformation of the hospital is perhaps most vividly illustrated here by the Fenwick Operating Theatre, the circular building in the center, which was largely financed by Dr. Kenneth Fenwick, the leading surgeon at the hospital. This was a teaching amphitheatre for students to witness new procedures, and these facilities became extremely popular at hospitals at the time. I've included a recent exterior view of the operating theatre to show how it's still recognizable today, even though it's much changed. And like the other early buildings of the hospital, it tells the story of how this institution was transformed. This is the only pre-1920 operating amphitheatre in Canada known to have survived. And I really encourage you, as I did Dr. Lowe 20 years ago, to really walk around the hospital and to trace these buildings, the outline of which have become incorporated into the evolving hospital complex in the 20th century. If we look at a historical view of the interior of the operating theatre around 1900, you can see the evolution to the well-illuminated, highly functional, and sterile environment that we're familiar with today. It was these new approaches that also revolutionized ideas about nursing care, an increasingly specialized role of nursing in the hospital, and the application of antiseptic procedures, the preparation of patients for surgery and post-surgical care. In this period before antibiotic drugs, their attention to ward and patient cleanliness was especially critical to the emergence of the hospital as a center of scientific medicine. It was Dr. Fenwick who was also instrumental in the establishment of an apprenticeship-based nursing school at Kingston General Hospital in 1886, hence the 125th anniversary. And this was one of the earliest to be established at lay hospitals in Canada. Initially, nursing students lived on a floor of the nickel wing and received apprenticeship training in the hospital, attending to patients in the wards and in the operating rooms. But it was really the construction of a separate nurses' home in 1903-1904 that really signaled the emergence of nursing as a profession. Situated at the rear of the hospital and later called the Baillie building, it became integral to the evolving hospital complex, giving nurses at the training school a place of their own that supported their daily lives and also their careers. This bird's eye view illustration depicts the hospital as it would have appeared about 1920, showing the interesting complex of buildings that are remarkable for documenting the transformation of healthcare in Canada. When I researched the Kingston General Hospital, I came across this quote from the hospital's 1912 annual report, which is almost 100 years ago, which I still find striking in terms of summing up that transformation. The city is rapidly growing, filling up with a class of people to whom a hospital, in case of sickness, is a necessity. The prejudice against hospitals is fast vanishing, and the public, now both rich and poor, coming to realize that in many forms of sickness, the hospital is the only place where successful treatment can be assured. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Dianne, who will tell us more about how that transformation is reflected in the nursing residents here and in others across Canada. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take a little bit of poetic license with the story behind this photo. It's actually of a 1921 graduating class from the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria. But I want you to imagine these women on their way to the polling station to go to vote. Because we do know that their matron, Jessie Mackenzie, hired a similar touring limousine to do just that. Further, she instructed her students to vote Liberal. Later, they said that for a lark, they all voted Conservative, although they wouldn't dare tell her. Stories like this one bring to light to life the role that nurses' residences played in helping both the rank and file and their leaders in nursing to form a new profession. The car, the driver, the trip, the experience of voting for the very first time in history all capture the excitement that these young women must have felt in pioneering a new role for women. Behind the scenes is their nursing leader, who went to the trouble and expense of hiring a car and a driver to ensure that her young charges took advantage of their opportunity to vote. Now, the Liberals the Liberals had brought in women's suffrage in 1917 in British Columbia, and in 1918, the Graduate Nurses Act, which explains Mackenzie's allegiance to the Liberals. Now, while the students respected their leader enough to go and vote, they were independent enough to make their own decision. Still, they were grateful for the secret ballot because they didn't want to disappoint her by telling them how they voted. Just a little background. My comments today are based on a research report on nurses' residences in Canada, which led to the designation of the Anne Baillie building, as well as 4 other nurses' residences. And this, of course, is part of a larger effort on the part of Parks Canada to enhance the representation of women in the commemoration of persons, places, and events that have been designated as nationally significant. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'd like to explore some of the facets of nursing history through the lens of the nurses' residence. Of course, I'll throw in lots of photos to make it lively, but I don't mean this to be an entirely nostalgic walk down memory lane for those of you who may remember sleeping on the veranda of the Anne Baillie building or escaping through the fire exit. Rather, I'm hoping that we can look critically at what some of these nursing moments meant to the development of the profession, and perhaps also look at a few others that we might not be as fond of remembering. Here are the National Historic Sites. The Anne Baillie building, of course, was erected in 1903 to 4, and is the nurses' residence of the Kingston General Hospital. Pavillon Meilleur, on the bottom left, was built in 1932 as the nurses' residence for Notre-Dame Hospital in Montreal. Pavillon Hersey, the top right, was built for Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, first in 1907, but an addition was added in 1932. St. Boniface Nursing Residence at St. Boniface Hospital near Winnipeg was built in 1928, and Begbie Hall on the top left was built in 1926 for the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, British Columbia. These designations help save a valuable piece of our built heritage, but more than that, they help show visitors the story of Canadian history, Canadian nursing history. Now, history is always about context, so nurses' history and nurses' stories also shed light on the history of medicine, the hospital development, and on women's history. This is particularly evident at the Anne Baillie, where a new permanent exhibit on nursing adds an interpretive component. Like all historic sites, these buildings give us a real physical connection to the past. By looking, feeling, touching, being enclosed by the space, we can vividly imagine what life was like for a young, homesick nursing student trying to understand anatomy, or a superintendent trying to develop a nursing curriculum. Being there does that in a way that nothing else can. Not reading a book, not looking at a photograph, nothing else. For those of you who like signpost, here's the outline of what I'm going to say. First, I'll explore what the exteriors of the buildings have to say, what it meant to have a purpose-built home. Then we'll look at the setting of the buildings, where they were located. And that leads nicely into a discussion on the two traditions of nursing in Canada, the Protestant Nightingale tradition and the much older Catholic tradition. Finally, we'll go inside the buildings and look at three functions that they performed. They were a place to socialize, a place to live, a place to socialize, and thirdly, a place to learn. And then, of course, I'll sum things up. All of the nurses' residences that were designated were what is called purpose-built, which simply means that it was built for a particular purpose, in this case, to provide a residence or a living space for nursing students. McGill architectural historian Anne-Marie Adams was the first to do an academic study on a nurse's residence. This one was built in 1907 at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, now called the Pavillon Hersey. Adams called her article Rooms of Their Own, the nurses' residences at Montreal's Royal Vic. She borrowed this phrase from a book by British author Virginia Woolf called A Room of One's Own, which was based on a series of lectures that Woolf gave in 1928 to women at Cambridge University. At that time, she argued that in order for a woman to write fiction, and here I think we can substitute anything, any sort of intellectual or professional endeavor, she must have literal and figurative space. That is, one, she has to have a room of her own, and she needs to have a key and a lock as well, and enough money to support herself. In the 1920s, when many of these nursing residences were being built, even middle-class women with means could not be assured of an education in any field of her choosing, and most professions were closed to women. Thus, Adams' borrowing of Woolf's phrase is apt. These buildings gave women who sought careers in nursing a symbolic place in the public sphere devoted entirely to them. Adams concluded that nursing leaders and physicians and administrators deliberately built elegant residences, buildings that positively shouted permanence and status. They did this as a way of asserting nurses' status, and also to attract middle-class women, or what they would have called a better class of women, to nursing. Yet at the same time, these buildings were quietly home-like. In this case, Edward and William Sutherland Maxwell, the architects who designed it, were specialists in domestic architecture. For those who might be worried about women moving into the public sphere and unsure of the newfound respectability of nursing, a home was just the setting to quiet their misgivings. The Anne Baillie building was built actually several years before the one we just saw. Although smaller, this attractive two-story limestone building can certainly be described as stately, with its massive columns and its huge veranda. The imposing stairs leading up to the grand entrance give it the feel of a decidedly upscale home. Inside there were 22 rooms and a lounge with a fireplace for receiving visitors, a spacious entrance hall, and a drawing room. Nurses must have felt special to have a room of their own in such a grand space, especially when we see that in the context of what came before these homes. That is, nurses were lucky to have even a ward to themselves in the hospital, and in some cases, they were expected to sleep in any empty bed in the hospital and be on call 24 hours a day, much like a domestic servant would have been. Sometimes the setting of a building tells us as much about it as the building itself. In this case, location is everything. Nurses' homes, or the nurses' home in this case, as it was first called, was located at the back of the hospital, facing south toward the lake. Long before the area was built up with and filled up with buildings, students from the residence could walk along this pathway, walk out the front door and along the pathway down to the lake, and even sitting on the veranda would have given them a lovely view of the water. However, in practical terms, the nurses' residence was set within and very much a part of the hospital, and often affiliated with the medical faculty at a university. At the Royal Vic, the architect used the same Scottish baronial style to visually link the residence with the hospital. He also added embellishments to a passageway that connected the residence to the hospital. And in our research into nurses' residences across Canada, we also found a number of tunnels connecting the residence to the hospital. And of course, all of this served to remind nurses as if they could ever forget that their duties lay within the hospital. But not all buildings were stately or domestic or surrounded by nature. Rather, this 5-story brown brick structure is barely distinguishable from the rest of the hospital complex in which it's a part. It's not even a freestanding building. This is Notre-Dame Hospital, situated on Sherbrooke East in Montreal. The Mayeux residence was built in 1932, and it's one of the earliest French Catholic nurses' residences to be built. In fact, they built residences much later than in the rest of Canada. This, of course, reflects the differences in the two traditions of Canadian nursing. I'm sure everyone recognizes the woman on the left, the iconic mother of nursing in the British world, Florence Nightingale. Beside her is Mother Mayeux of the Grey Nuns, who founded the nursing school at Notre-Dame in 1897, and it was one of the first French language schools of nursing. When Nightingale and her followers began to reform British nursing, it was at that time being performed by illiterate, working-class domestic laborers, for the most part. But Catholic sisters were well-respected and skilled nurses. These women also ran pharmacies and other departments of hospitals. Indeed, they ran the hospitals. In the current wave of revisionist interpretation on Nightingale, or the Nightingale system, it has been noted that the great lady herself respected the work of Catholic sisters. Indeed, she borrowed much from them and envied their autonomy in the hospital. Nightingale also admired the Catholic nuns' lifelong vocation in nursing. Of course, she differed with them on religious grounds, and her goal was to establish secular nursing. In the British Nightingale tradition, at least in Canada, great importance was attached to the purpose-built nurses' residence. That is not the case in the Catholic system. The reason is simply that they weren't needed. There were many mother houses and convents available with sufficient space to house nurses. There, religious and lay nurses often lived in the same building, although they were usually housed in separate wings of the building. The French Catholic nursing tradition was imported from France and had roots in the medieval world. The Augustines founded Hotel-Dieu in Quebec City in 1639, and from this beginning they trained staff who then went out and established more hospitals and actually a network of hospitals across North America. Some of the religious leaders were also linked to the founding of the colonies and of major cities. It's clear then that they did not face the image problem that Nightingale encountered. And that is reflected in the buildings. They have left many hospitals, convents, mother houses that are prominent structures in many cities. Okay, before we move on to look at the interiors of the building, I'll just point out quickly that the other two nurses' residences that were designated, Begbie Hall and St. Boniface, were built in the 1920s, and they reflect a dramatic shift away from more domestic feel to the building and toward a more institutional look. That, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more when I talk about education. But let's look at the inside of the nurses' residence, which served three functions. One, they provided a place to live or sleeping quarters for student nurses and their matrons. Number two, they provided a social space where nurses could relax, have fun, form friendships, and develop solidarity with other nurses. Three, they provided educational space or a place to learn, which of course is at the core of the consolidation of the nursing profession. This photo is of a bedroom from the Hersey Pavilion. Living space is, at its most basic, a place, a bed to sleep in, a place to hang your clothes, a place to wash up after a long shift. In their new living quarters, student nurses lived in a reasonably comfortable atmosphere. They were relatively free of the dangers and discomforts of the hospital. Building interiors were tastefully but conservatively furnished, and again this reflects the aspirations of nursing leaders to form a profession. I should point out, however, that over time many of these lovely spacious rooms became overcrowded, as sometimes as many as 2, 3, even 5 nurses shared the same space. They took turns sleeping, apparently. Still, nurses did make these places their own, establishing various traditions and rituals. This 1925 photograph of bedtime was taken after the night shift at the residence built actually before Begbie Hall. Of course, a nurse's bedroom could also double as a party room. Given the close proximity in which nursing students lived, they did become very close. It helped that they at that time were a very homogeneous group. All were women, and this at a time when women shared more social time than they do today. They were predominantly the same age, as nursing schools usually accepted women from approximately age 21 to about 30. And they were similar in socioeconomic class and educational background, except perhaps the superintendents. Further, they were racially homogeneous. While this fostered a nurturing camaraderie among nurses, there is a negative side to it. It was built on the exclusion of non-whites, Chinese and Japanese in British Columbia, Aboriginal women, and others. And of course, men. Those groups began to join the profession, however, after the Second World War, when the profession became more secure. It was not only nursing students who lived in these buildings. Matrons often lived there too, although in accord with the hierarchy of the times, they would have an apartment, not just a room. In the architectural plans for the 1932 extension to the Hersey residence, for example, there were plans for a large 4-bedroom apartment for the superintendent. Interestingly, it overlooked the main hallway, so it gave the matron a clear view of who was coming and going. That reflects the live-in nursing superintendent's role as a kind of substitute mother. She was supposed to supervise not only the nurses' work lives, but their social lives. This is the nursing student on the chaperone date in 1909. In this supervisory role, matrons sometimes imposed some very strict rules of conduct, which to our eyes today seem very silly, draconian even. But for their time, they did serve a function. First, they protected an emerging and still insecure profession from any taint of scandal. Secondly, they protected individual nurses from unwanted advances from patients, physicians, family members, so on. Because in the world in which they lived, nurses needed to preserve their reputations in order to function effectively. Sometimes the nursing residents served to bring nurses together in solidarity in times of crisis. In 1913, Mary Southcott at St. John's Hospital in Newfoundland came into conflict with the medical superintendent, Lawrence Keegan. He effectively usurped her role in making nursing appointments. And this precipitated a crisis that led to a provincial inquiry. Coming to Southcott's aid, and this happened at several late-night meetings in the nurses' residence, the nurses planned a petition in her support, and some of the ward sisters offered to resign in protest. Despite much evidence in Southcott's favor and suspicions regarding Keegan, the inquiry led to the downgrading of Southcott's authority and her eventual departure. While this this incident occurred at a residence that is not one of the designated buildings, I wanted to include it because I think the story demonstrates the tenuous hold that early nursing had in the hospital. In a very public conflict between a male doctor and a female nurse, it proved easier to scapegoat the nurse. Nurses' residences were not just places to sleep. Later residences built in the 20s, like Baillie Hall, which housed 209 students, included some elaborate social and recreational spaces. The need for nurses to release tension after their long hours on the ward had gained acceptance by the 1920s. In fact, this is summed up by the noted hospital architect Edward Stevens. He said, "Any hospital of considerable size should have its nurses' residence. This should be a separate building, not too remote from the hospital, but far enough away so that the noises of an entertainment, a dancing party, or a romp would not disturb the patients." This is the pink room in Baillie Hall. It was the focal point for many parties and ceremonies. All the residences had similar sitting rooms, usually quite elegant, with pianos and other middle-class accoutrements. The furnishings and decorative touches were usually conservative, with lots of wood paneling, fireplaces, and sturdy furniture. Nursing students valued such rooms. I know this because in many of the nurses' residences that I visited, which were under threat, they were the ones that nursing alumni associations were working hard to preserve. For example, the salon at the Pavillon Meilleur had been preserved in its original state with only minor alterations to paint and wallpaper. Spaces meant to add to the comfort of the nurses' residences included at the top the large inviting sunroom from the expanded Anne Baillie building, not the nurses' home, but the larger one built in 1927. At the bottom left is the Peacock Alley in the Hersey building in Montreal. With a secure social space at their disposal, young nursing students were free to establish their own traditions, to celebrate milestones in their training. Here, young nursing students from Royal Jubilee Hospital marked the transition from boots to shoes. And here, the discarding of old uniforms, which apparently had to be signed. This was called Right-On Day. A more formal occasion, the capping ceremony, was sometimes performed in the sitting rooms of residences with the matron officiating. Besides the central meeting or living room, newer residences built in the 1920s had gymnasiums, ballrooms, and assembly halls with stages. This allowed nurses to create their own entertainment, which it sounds like they did a lot of. Costume parties were very popular, so were playing cards, and making fudge seemed to be really popular too. Nurses' residences were also a place to learn, and this is most clearly reflected in the newer residences, or at least the ones built in the 1920s. For example, Begbie Hall had a training school in the basement with 2 lecture rooms, a science laboratory, a dietetic lab, 1 demonstration and practice room, and a reference library for 25 students. By contrast, when the Anne Baillie nurses' home was built 2 decades early in 1903, there was little evidence of learning. At that time, nursing education was at war with the demands of the hospital. The best a well-intentioned nursing superintendent could do was to try to sandwich a few lectures in between shifts on the ward, and that is if you could persuade a doctor to give the lecture. This reflects the apprenticeship-style training in which student nurses worked long hours in the hospital, learned on the job, and provided hospitals with its basic nursing workforce. This was clearly exploitative, at least by today's standards, and many nurse historians and contemporaries justifiably condemned it. However, one could argue, as Katherine McPherson has done, that by the standards of the late 19th century, and the early 20th century for that matter, it was simply an exchange of work for accreditation. When nurses finished their training, they could call themselves graduate and then registered nurses. Nonetheless, apprenticeship training was becoming increasingly anachronistic by the 1920s. Much of the credit for that change can go to early nursing superintendents, such as Jessie Mackenzie from the voting incident, who gained class time for nurses and built a curriculum from scratch back in even as early as the 1910s. A little later, Anne Baillie, nursing superintendent at KGH, I'm sure you all recognize her, she helped to maintain a very high educational standard at the Kingston General Hospital. Queen's University actually became the 5th university to establish a degree program in nursing in 1942. That was the last year of Baillie's tenure, and I'm sure that she had a great deal to do with that, making that happen. Clearly, more time was being devoted to formal nursing by the 20s. This is evident in the addition of classrooms. And as we can see, there is also a transition from predominantly male physician instructors to more female nursing superintendents providing instruction to the nurses. Reference libraries were added to allow nursing students the resources to study. This is the chemistry lab at St. Boniface, nurses' residence, but other residences had similar facilities. Many residences also had dietetic laboratories and demonstration rooms, and maybe that's where they made the fudge. While nursing superintendents took the lead in forming and in training and teaching formulating nursing curricula, education is always a two-way street, and nurses also participated. Working with the ill and dying had its sobering moments, and nurses were subjected to strict rules, long hours, and were exposed to disease. Often they enlivened their long days by riding laundry hampers through the tunnels. I'm sure that wasn't allowed. Or putting the skeleton to more comic than educational uses. Tricks and pranks helped make the work lighter and fostered the camaraderie that helped them to learn and support each other. Education was a cornerstone in the strategy to gain professional stature for nurses, and this was built from the ground up through the nursing alumni associations and fostered in the protective women-only space of the nurses' residence. Nursing leaders like Mabel Hersey, superintendent at the Royal Vic in Montreal from 1908 to 1938, were instrumental. She developed a teaching department and helped launch a graduate program for nurses at McGill University in 1920. Agnes Snively, superintendent at the Toronto General Hospital, founded the Canadian National Association for Training Nurses in 1908, and she turned her nursing alumni newsletter at TGH into the profession's first national journal, The Canadian Nurse. And Ethel Johns was its editor for many years and was another leader in the professionalization drive. Of course, I think it's only appropriate to mention that not everyone believes that nursing achieved professional status. Some historians have argued that nursing is better described as a quasi or subordinate profession, even part of the pink collar ghetto. They cite struggles for equality within the university and the hospital, the weak self-regulating powers, and the fact that nursing is still seen as subordinate to medicine. Others condemn the concept of professionalism because it excludes other caregivers. With all its imperfections, however, nurses did improve their professional standing significantly from the days of Florence Nightingale in the 1850s. History is about context. Professionalism, talking about professionalism, takes me back to my starting point, the nurses going off to vote. Instead of looking at what nurses didn't achieve, let's look at what they did accomplish. Albeit within a specific environment, the hospital, nurses took on the work of nurturing, an amorphous task traditionally done by women as part of their unpaid domestic labor. And they did it well enough to demand recognition for it. And they did this at a time when women were prohibited from entering most professions. Nurses then went on to create an educational curriculum, gained entry into the university, into institutions of higher learning, and they obtained a recognized title and standards for nursing. I can't leave without acknowledging those fabulous radio commercials that I've been hearing about nurses. I especially love the one where the nurse is congratulated for the career hat trick after she does a long shift in which she delivers 3 babies. Have everyone heard these? No? Yeah, that'd be a great. She uses the vocabulary of pro sports. Well, it's all about the patient. And I just took it 1 contraction at a time, and I gave it 110%. So, the image that this conjures up, for me at least, of a world where caregivers are valued as highly as entertainers is a very compelling one. In part, I think it explains the support that early suffragists gave to nursing. I think they saw in nursing the prospect that should nursing be elevated to a more distinguished standing, so too might also the work of all women, the work that all women do, because women do nurturing work. Now, to sum up, I want to first thank Dr. Lowe, the staff and the board of the museum, and its many, many, many local supporters for allowing me to be here to participate in the first of 5 annual nursing history events. It really is an honor. The designation of an Baillie National Historic Site remains a highlight in my career at Parks, and it just keeps getting better. Every time I come here, there's more things to celebrate. It's wonderful. And I want to extend my congratulations to all involved on the 20th anniversary of the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston. Historic sites are an expensive and a time-consuming hobby, and it's only in the hands of very dedicated people devoted to preserving, protecting, and interpreting them that they succeed. Clearly, everything is in good hands in Kingston. You bring these buildings alive, and you should be very proud of what you've accomplished here. And now, finally, last but not least, I want to congratulate all the nurses here for their active involvement in their own history. Nurses are a model to others in the support that they give for places like Anne Baillie. Indeed, I would venture to say that nurses, in jealously guarding their history, are probably giving war vets a run for their money. They're very jealously guard their history. Maybe that has something to do with the military-like training that they took. I don't know. I do know that in my efforts over the last 15 years to increase the representation of women in historic commemorations, I have found that most women are maddeningly modest about their historic achievements. In fact, you have to persuade them that they have any at all. But that's not the case with nurses. They have a very developed historic sense, and they continue to support remembering their history, and I think that all of you are a model to others. And last but not least, let me congratulate the KGH Nurses alumni on their 125th anniversary of the founding of their school. You are all doing an outstanding job of keeping the school's memory alive, and I think it's wonderful what you're doing, and I thank you again for inviting me, and keep up the good work. Okay, thank you.